Good evening, everyone. Again, welcome to the 42nd episode of Indian ICC BiZ Live. Today, we have with us a very eminent economist, Dr. Rajat Kathuria. At present, he is head of Department of Shiv Nadar University of Economics, head of Department of Economics. But he had previously held several Government of India posts, including the head of ICRIA and all that. But over to you, sir. Request to give a brief introduction of yourself.
Sure. Thank you, Rajashri. It's a pleasure to be here and to be talking to the members of ICC. It's really an honor, and thank you for this opportunity. My name is, as Rajashri said, my name is Rajat Kathuria. I'm at Shiv Nadar University in the Department of Economics. I'm also the Dean of the School of Humanities and Social Sciences. I finished 5 years here, and the distinguishing feature of this particular assignment of mine is that I not only get to interact with economists, which I've been doing throughout my life, but I also get to interact a lot with other humanities disciplines, international relations, historians, sociologists, people from English literature, art and design, rural management, and also from different fields of the sciences as well, because it's a multidisciplinary university. So it's really a pleasure to be in the center of an intellectually very stimulating environment. Before I joined Shiv Nadar University, I was the director of Indian Council for Research on International Economic Relations, which is the think tank working largely on trade, but many other issues. Trade was what ICRIA had started doing, but it then graduated into covering most disciplines of economics, including the digital economy, which has become very popular now. ICRIA largely works both with other think tanks, it works with non-government organizations, and it works very closely with Ministry of Commerce and Ministry of Finance, among other ministries as well. I graduated from Delhi University. I did my PhD from the University of Maryland at College Park. Thereafter, I came back to India. I've taught at a business school in India and the International Management Institute. I've been the economic advisor for the Telecom Regulatory Authority of India. I've worked for the World Bank in Washington. And I've also worked in government, both, as I said, in the Telecom Regulatory Authority, but also I've been advising the government on various issues. So that's a brief background. Largely, I specialize in areas of industrial organization, international trade, institutions, and markets, and why markets work and why sometimes markets don't work as well as we expect them to work.
Thank you, sir. So today's discussion is on my multilateralism versus bilateralism. With the splurge of FTAs, and nowadays, corporate India is looking at with whom or with which country our country signing FTAs and getting a substantial tariff reduction so that they can develop the export markets. As similarly, they can import their requirements at a lower tariff. So the question is, before we go into this FTS plus, what has you are an international trade expert? Has WTO been successful, or WTO has failed as a global multilateral body? What is your opinion?
Well, I think if you push me to the edge of a precipice and force me to answer that question, I think I would say largely the WTO has been a success, especially when you compare it with other multilateral institutions. The WTO has actually performed and created value, and I will tell you why. Although today it's in a coma, it's not functioning as well as it was supposed to. But in terms of having achieved its objective, and one can go back to the GATT of post-World War, but let's stick to WTO that was created in 1995. I will say that it's been a success because it's been able to get tariff reductions in place and reductions of quotas, reductions of tariffs over a large volume of trade, and the volume of trade today has gone up, 3 to 4 times what it was when WTO came into being. So, in terms of doing what it was supposed to do, liberalize a large extent of trade, the WTO has been successful. Plus, the WTO, as opposed to the GATT, uh, continues to have, although it's not functioning, what is called a dispute settlement body and a dispute settlement undertaking. As you know, the laws are only as good as they are able to be implemented, and if don't comply, there are penalties that are imposed, and those penalties are imposed by a settlement body or dispute settlement function. It is like the court system. uh, so that was a distinguishing sort of element of the WTO. And it then created jurisprudence on more than 600 cases that it heard and settled. And largely, they were the results of the judgments of the dispute settlement. It's a two-tiered system. You have a panel and then you have an appellate body, which constitutes the dispute settlement function. So largely, the dispute settlement especially itself created jurisprudence which then became applicable, and that knowledge has been created, what is permissible, what is not permissible, and there's a lot of nuance there. But I think on both those elements, liberalization of a substantial amount of trade and then having trade to increase 3 to 4 times, creating a dispute settlement mechanism and therefore jurisprudence and knowledge, I think these are two manifestations of success of the WTO. The problem today, especially since 2019, this is when the US blocked the appointment of a person in the appellate body, and therefore it has become dysfunctional. The appointments of the members have been blocked by the United States, and without a member in the appellate body, it becomes a black hole, and you don't know what's going to happen there, because if you file a case, you're filing a case into a void. So that's not functioning. But before that, and before that, it was functioning, and even after 2019, the WTO is doing. People are filing their trade policy reviews. They're filing their submissions to the WTO. So I think overall, I would not discredit what the WTO has done. Of course, like other UN institutions, what has happened in the WTO is that it has become sort of bureaucratic, as you would expect. There's a lot of bureaucracy in the WTO, and as organizations become larger, they become more and more bureaucratic. And one of the things that I've noticed, and if you permit me to express this thought, which is that the WTO is supposed to be doing trade liberalization, and therefore you would expect that there would be economists and people with an economics background who will work there, and there's still lots of economists working there. But what's happened over time is, because it's a rule-based multilateral order that one is talking about. So, when negotiations happen, also rules get framed, rules get written, agreements get signed, and therefore there's a lot of people from the judiciary or with a judicial background that have come into the WTO. I'm not making a value judgment on it, but simply as the evolution of the organization, it's now a lot more rule. There are a lot more rules which have to be implemented. So it's moved from being an organization that was represented by economists to an organization that has an overwhelming representation of people from the judiciary. No value judgment here, just the transformation of the organization. And if you permit me, one more point about the WTO, which is that these are difficult times for the WTO, and the reason it's difficult time for the WTO is because trade itself is no longer about tariffs and quotas. And if you allow me to draw a parallel with another regulatory agency that I worked in, which also did rules and regulations, as I mentioned in my introduction, is the Telecom Regulatory Authority of India. Let me try and draw a parallel for your members so that they can appreciate what I'm saying. When telecom liberalization started in India, uh, the focus was largely on how do you get new players, how do you get more competition, how do you, reflect tariffs, how do you regulate tariffs, how do you do interconnection, which is connecting one operator with another, how do you price interconnection, and all of that. And as you know, 2 decades of liberalization since 1998, about 2.5 decades, what's happened to the telecom business? It's completely transformed. It's no longer about pricing. It's no longer only about interconnection. It's become so much more about competition issues. It's so much become about digital issues. It's become about size. It's become about content. It's become about complex offerings of digital products by telecom operators. It's become about multi-services. It's become about two-sided markets. And the point I'm making, Rajarshi, is that telecom has become an extremely complex business. And therefore, to regulate it requires a lot more challenge and a lot more nuance and a lot more of expertise and skills to be able to regulate telecom well. And it's exactly the same thing that has happened with trade and the WTO. Trade has become complex. It's no longer, as I said, about tariffs and quotas. Tariffs are still important, and the WTO plays a role in that. And as you said, bilateral arrangements also play a role in reducing tariffs. But it's no longer only about tariffs and quotas. Trade has become much more about now standards and regulatory harmonization, about mutual recognition arrangements, about sanitary and phytosanitary conditions, all about what economists will call standards of the products. And therefore, there is a challenge there, because while you're exporting or importing a product, you're also exporting or importing a standard. You have to either comply with the standard of the other market, or others have to comply with your standards. And India has been a little wary about complying with standards, because the standards of the West, typically the countries that we trade with, I mean, those environmental standards, those labor standards, you talk about human rights, the competition standards, you talk about the public sector standards, you talk about subsidies, you talk about agricultural standards, you talk about product standards. And there are standards that have become pervasive, and some of the more modern trade agreements are in fact not about tariffs at all. They're all about harmonization of standards. And this complexity, especially the digital complexity, the digital trade, the kind of safety standards. Europe has the GDPR, which is General Data Protection Rules, which mandates that privacy should be respected, and who can provide data, who cannot provide data, what is the kind of standards that companies that have data have to abide by. All of those are now dominating the language of international trade, and therefore you need people with more expertise. It's become more complex, and therefore trade today is not the trade of the last 2 or 3 decades. It's a whole new ball game. Yes.
So, sir, the dispute settlement mechanism is no longer active because of the USA.
That is correct.
Okay.
So you're largely so the appellate body is not functional. The panels function, but the appellate body is not functioning. So if you have a dispute and if you get a judgment against you in the panel, the person who loses, the country that loses, will go and appeal, because that's what the WTO process is. You can appeal, and if you appeal, it's like the Supreme Court. If the Supreme Court is not functioning, even if you lose the case in the High Court, and if you appeal to the Supreme Court and the Supreme Court is not functioning, let's say, then the case doesn't get decided. So the judgment doesn't mean anything. So countries are appealing into what is called a void, and therefore the process is unable to move forward.
So, sir, what I infer from you, some inherent bias has crept in WTO, which is making trade more complex and making countries opt for bilateral arrangements. Am I right? This is the underlying message I'm getting from you.
That is correct. That is correct. And just to add a little bit of sort of layer that argument, uh, is that, if you look at the way the WTO worked in the beginning, at the periods of hyper globalization before 2008, before the global financial crisis, and even after that, the problems started, after 2015, 16, then COVID came in, and all of that. But before that, liberalization had happened. China came into the WTO. uh, what happened was that, one of the major developments of this century has been the economic rise of China. I'm not going to talk about the military or the geostrategic rise of China. That also is a compliment. But the economic rise of China meant that United States did not remain the hegemon, or did not remain the single most important economic power in the world. The power had to be shared. That made, of course, United States a little anxious. When it was the hegemon, when it was setting the rules, basically United States, when it was the hegemon, the rules were set by it. But when China began to rise and the United States began to feel some of the negative effects of the rise of China, which is what is called, labor, manufacturing, etc., losing jobs being exported to China. All of that narrative was created by the US, both during the time of Obama administration, but especially afterwards by the first Trump administration. It has continued into the second President Trump administration. The rise of China has led United States to withdraw from the WTO. And by withdraw, I just don't mean stop funding the WTO. By withdrawing from the WTO means doing things that are violative of the principles enshrined in the WTO, sometimes in letter, but definitely in spirit. It has violated a lot of the provisions of the WTO, rules that it itself had helped create in the first place. Remember, as I said, the United States was the hegemon. It had helped put together the rules of international trading order. But once the system began to go against it, or what the Americans felt that the system was not working in their favor, I can argue it was working in their favor. But even if you believe their perception that the system was not working in their favor, it did not mean that they should have exited the system, because it was a system that they had helped put together. So they should, like other countries had complied with the WTO provisions, like the other countries complied with the rules of the WTO, it was incumbent upon the United States also to comply with the provisions of the WTO. But because it was so powerful, and because it is so powerful, it could get away with it, and therefore it decided that it was going to do things outside the WTO. And because it became costly for it to respect the rules and laws and the provisions and the judgments of the WTO, sometimes unjustifiably, sometimes you could say justifiably, it felt that the system was working against them. It decided to withdraw. But it's important to recognize that no other country had the economic power or the economic might to say the system is not working for me and therefore I will dump it. The Europeans didn't say that, the Japanese didn't say that, the Koreans, or no other country said that, but the United States said that and did it. Not only said it, but they did it, and therefore they withdrew from the WTO. So multilateralism, as we know it, is today in a coma. Some people pronounced it dead. Maybe it's too early to say it's dead. It might emerge in a different avatar. Uh, but it's important to understand that the country that helped put the system in place is the country that accelerated its demise. or at least it's going into the ICU.
So the MFN concept no longer holds, or
No, it
apparently
does.
there
It
in
does. It
paper.
does hold. I mean, as I said, the WTO is still functioning, and people, countries are still trading on what they have committed multilaterally in the WTO. It's only in the case of a dispute. If there is a dispute, then what the fate of that dispute is going to be is uncertain because of the lack of functioning of the dispute settlement body. But the WTO, in terms of what the rules are in place, countries are trading on MFN principles, countries are trading on the MFN tariffs, etc. That still goes on. Yes, it's the new rules, the new multilateral rules that are difficult to put in place.
So what I informed, the broader framework is there, but people are concentrating on their own economic benefits, like the European Union has put on non-tariff barriers by way of carbon content and all that, and GDPR and all that. More non-tariff barriers have come into play. So WTO is nowadays has been, though the broader framework has been weakened. Am I right?
That is correct. So the WTO is definitely weakened compared to what it was in the past. And the reason it's weakened, Rajashi, is because uh, the country that helped or put together rules-based trading order has decided to withdraw from it. And countries have decided to create some sort of a uh, system where you can settle disputes outside of the WTO within the confines of a multilateral framework. It's called the multi-party arbitration arrangement, MPIAA. Some countries have put together something which is called a multi-party alternative arrangement for arbitration. And what they are hoping is that if ever the WTO starts functioning like it was in the past, this could simply merge back into the dispute settlement body. But that seems unlikely. So the I would say the conclusion or inference that there is a weakened WTO is absolutely spot on. Weakened multilateralism is especially spot on. But what has happened, like much like when you leave space in a system, and you have like sometimes you say in management you say that work expands to fill in the time that you have. uh, so there is space in the system. What has happened in that because of the exit of multilateralism as we knew it, bilateral arrangements, plurilateral arrangements, large regional arrangements come into place to complement, I wouldn't say replace the WTO because nothing can replace the WTO. The WTO was a global organization with consensus, with 166 member countries, so you can't really replace it. But what's happened is that you've got bilateral agreements in place, you've got regional free trade agreements in place like the RCEP or the CPTPP that have come in to step into the space that has been left by the WTO. So it's not that trade liberalization is not happening or that trade is not happening between countries. Yes, there is more protectionism also, but the protectionism, as you yourself mentioned, is not taking the form of tariffs. Tariffs are there, but they are not going up to 50%, 60%, 100% like they were when we were emerging. We used to have very high average tariff rates. Today our own tariff rates have come down significantly below single digit. They are below double digit levels. They are in single digits now, the average applied tariff that we have. So tariffs have come down globally. But what has happened is that, as I was saying, is that there are a lot of non-tariff measures that countries have put in place, and those are being negotiated between, in within these trading blocks or bilateral arrangements. And as you would know, as everybody would know, that who benefits from bilateral arrangements, who benefits from these large trading blocks. Of course, it's the powerful countries. Why is the United States withdrawn from the WTO? Why is it forcing countries to find bilateral agreements with it? It is doing so because it can gain more from those arrangements. The rich and the powerful countries will gain more from bilateral because they have much more leverage over the system. In the WTO multilateral framework, even a Gambia or a Sudan or a Libya or an India or a Bangladesh or a Pakistan had the same power as other rich countries. But in the bilateral arrangements, rich countries are able to exploit their leverage much more than in the which is why the multilateral system was so good for emerging markets, because they had a voice and they could prevent things to pass which didn't meet their objectives or aims, which are not beneficial to them. But to cut a long story short, Rajashi, what I'm saying is that the bilateral arrangements have come in to take the place, and trade liberalization is happening within those bilateral or regional agreements. But the gains from trade, therefore, are being now leveraged by countries that have important power influence in the system, like the United States and China, of course.
So it's a great learning, sir. The space created is being filled up by bilateral arrangements for two countries to maximize their own economic benefits. Wonderful. So, but the question is about what's created hell was these reciprocal tariffs of Trump. But their own court negated these tariffs. So, I mean, so now now they feel that one-to-one negotiations will help them more.
That is correct. That is correct. So, which is why, I remember many years ago there was an economist. There is an economist, very famous economist from India, but he lives in the United States in Columbia University. His name is Professor Jagdish Bhagwati. I'm sure most of you have heard of Professor Jagdish Bhagwati. And he was, very critical of the United States in the early 90s. I remember when President Clinton had just won the election, the United States in 1992 imposed what is called a Super 301 unilaterally on countries that it thought were violating the rules of the WTO, or at that time, the GATT. So countries that were violating rules, it's like you violate a traffic light and the person, instead of going to the police or going to a court, decides to take action himself or herself. That's what the United States was doing. And Professor Jagdish Bhagwati wrote an article which became very popular. And he said, just because you have the might, just because you are powerful, that doesn't mean you can take the system in your own hands. There is a process. And he called that article, it's a very evocative title for an article that Professor Bhagwati wrote. He called that article, "It's the Process, Stupid." And what that meant was that there is a process by which you will complain against other countries that are violating provisions of trade rules. But you can't do it unilaterally. You can't impose Super 301, which is the power that US Congress has given to the Department, to United States Trade Representative. And they use it unilaterally. And that was the beginning, I thought, or I think, of United States periodically using its power. It's like the law of the jungle, right? Might is right. Using its power to undermine rules that were negotiated between countries in a consensus-driven manner. So obviously, uh, a global system is about give and take. You can't always come out on the right side. If you're following a rules-based system, sometimes you will win, sometimes you will have to give in. You can't always win. Sometimes national interest will have to be compromised to an extent. And I think if countries like United States cannot, I'm sure they understand it, but if they cannot respect that, then they will get into bilateral arrangements and they will force Canada, they will force Mexico, they will force countries to do things that is to their advantage. So, I mean, they negotiated deals with Japan and Korea. Mr. Trump has negotiated deals with Japan and Korea, where Japan has promised to invest, $300 billion, $500 billion. Likewise, Korea has promised to invest huge amounts of money, and they've also increased tariff on reciprocal tariffs on Japan and Korea. And as a part of the deal to reducing those reciprocal tariffs to whatever 15% or 20%, Japan and Korea had to agree to invest billions of dollars in the US economy. Likewise, the European Union has promised to invest huge amounts of money in the United States. So it's one country that has the power and is being able to dictate the terms of engagement because of its power. And remember, the interesting thing is that President Trump has just made a visit to China. And when those tariffs were introduced, the Liberation Day tariffs were introduced by United States on China, China responded by its own reciprocal tariffs. And United States, the only country over which the United States could not exercise its leverage was China. Because China had the leverage. And remember what I said right in the beginning. This whole, if you were to take this whole global trade regime and the situation where it is today, one can trace it back to the problems that the United States is having with accommodating China as the new economic power, or to use the term that a lot of political scientists and international relations experts use, is to share its status as hegemon with China. So it's no longer a single hegemon. There are two major powers. And it took a lot of time for United States to accept the fact that there was another emerging power or emerged power that was equally, if not as powerful, or if not more powerful economically, or expected to become more powerful than the United States. And the sharing of this platform of economic might with China can be, excuse me, can be one of the foundational reasons for where we find ourselves in. And of course, United States will have to accept this reality. You can blame China that China's rise is because they compromised the system, they stole intellectual property, they subsidized their labor, they subsidized infrastructure, they subsidized finance, they stole intellectual property. All those complaints that the United States has made against China, they deliberately kept their currency down. They deliberately devalued their currency and kept it low so that they could gain access to markets abroad. All of these allegations have been made by the United States against China in the past. And therefore, United States saying that China hasn't respected the rules, and therefore we will also not respect the rules. Why should we be the only one? So, this debate about the respecting of the rules. So right now, the system, as I said, has collapsed, and no new rules are being written. But United States, so the leverage that the United States has over the rest of the world is not the same leverage that it has with China. In fact, China has equal leverage with the United States, which we've been seeing play out globally, both and recently in the visit of Mr. Trump to China.
So, sir, while these two superpowers are fighting out among themselves, ultimate aim from you, what I'm getting is to use trade as a tool to leverage, influence, and attract FDI and create more employment. Ultimately, so that he gets he or his party gets re-elected, isn't it?
That's Well, I mean, so the term that I'm sure all your members will be familiar with, there's a new term that is being used when I was doing international trade as a student. And I do international trade. Now, of course, I write on international trade. Now, when I read, there's a new terminology that has crept into the discourse on international trade. And that is called the weaponization of international trade. Earlier, I mean, I don't know how many if you do a search of articles written on international trade, and if you use the word weaponization, it was hardly ever used. But today, every other article talks about weaponization of your trade, weaponization of your markets, weaponization of your power. So trade has become a weapon to try and get as many benefits to yourself as much as possible. So therefore, there is a very interesting statement that has been made recently, which is that the line between geostrategic interests and international trade, the line between geopolitics and international trade, there was a fine dividing line, and that has completely collapsed. And so geopolitics, geoeconomics, international trade have all become one. And if United States does that, if China does that, if that it's a signal to other countries to also try and do as much as they can. But that dividing line, that weaponization is real. It's happening. The Iran war, you're seeing weaponization of trade. You're seeing weaponization of oil. I mean, it's now out in the open. What was muted and what was, in some sense, the post-war global trade order, the dominant response was, okay, let's try and respect the rules, and let's not destroy the rules or damage the rules. But today, respect of the rules has become marginal, has become peripheral, and the dominant incentive is to get as much benefit as you can for yourself. Yes, so I agree with you. But I disagree with one point that you made, and that's disagree in the sense that I just layer it. While the United States is doing exactly what you're saying, getting more investment for itself, its ability to create employment is going to be limited in traditional industries which are labor intensive. United States at 90,000 per capita income, 90,000 US dollars per capita income, is not a country that can produce the old industrial manufactured products. Yes, it can do EVs, it can do semiconductors, it can do high-tech items, it can do products, high-end products. But to expect that textiles, automobiles of the traditional kind, to expect that steel industry, to expect that manufacturing will come back into the United States because of all this investment that is coming in, I think that's like a pie in the sky. That's too much of an expectation, because it'll be, even if they do it, it'll be too expensive and nobody will want to buy it. And therefore, it will be like shooting yourself in the foot. So while I did talk about the fact that lots of investments are coming in from Europe, or at least promised from Europe and Japan and Korea, there are two things that I would caution against. One is how much of that will actually happen. And two, if that happens, which sectors will it happen in, and will it be able to create more employment in the manufacturing sectors, which President Trump keeps talking about. Remember, the United States economy is 80% services driven today. like most developed countries are, agriculture is only 2%, the rest is industry. Uh, so an economy that has a comparative advantage in services, to expect it to go back and become a powerhouse of manufacturing. They were once a powerhouse in manufacturing, but that ship has sailed for the United States and for Europe and for largely for Japan. And so China is the factory to the world today, and that mantle might pass to India. That mantle might is already passing to Vietnam and Cambodia and Thailand and Malaysia and Indonesia and Philippines, and of course Africa could be the next growth center for manufacturing in a few decades. But I don't think that will happen in the United States again. I can't hear you, Rajeshi. You're muted.
My next question is on India. We have grown economically over the last decade. While I will not go into dispute of whether we are the third largest or the fourth largest, but still we are among the top 10. How
Yes.
are we benefiting from bilateral trade arrangements? With whom, which countries we have? How are we benefiting economically?
Okay. I mean, I could go on about this. Let me try and be brief on that. That's a very important question. It's also a political economy question. If you talk to international trade people, including myself, I would say that, if we have bilateral trade agreements and if we are able to reduce tariffs as a result of those agreements, and we are able to import things cheaper, they benefit us. They benefit us, even though we may be running a current account deficit. Remember, we were not able to export in the 80s and 90s is because our very high import tariffs, and your companies, your members of your firms who actually do production would really understand this. An import tariff is an export tax. I will say that again. An import tariff is an export tax. So when we liberalized in 1991, suddenly our exports shot up because our imports came down. We were able to add value, we were able to produce cheaply, and we were able to export more. I mean, that's an idea. Of course, when you import more, you will run current account deficit. So therefore, to look at bilateral trade agreements that we did, look at bilateral trade agreements like with Korea and Japan, these were signed in 2010, 2011, 2012. We had all these agreements, and then we didn't do any agreement until we did one with UAE, and then we've done a flurry of agreements now in the last 2 or 3 years. But that interlude for about 1.5 decades, we did not do any trade agreement. And the reason we did not do any trade agreement was, while the economy was benefiting because of lower input cost, the problem that was happening politically was that we were running current account deficits with all the countries that we had a trade agreement with. And to make matters worse politically, and I will say this slowly so that I'm understood. For countries that we did not have a trading agreement with, which is the United States and Europe, for example, we were running a current account surplus. We were running surpluses. We've run surpluses, which is one of the problems that Trump has with us, is that we are running a surplus with the United States in goods trade. So if you put that argument together, if stitch that argument together, that we run current account deficits with countries that we have trade agreements with, we have current account surpluses with countries that we don't have trade agreements with, the conclusion that we drew at the political level was that the FTAs were bad, QED. And I think politically that was, of course, the thing to do. And of course, if you go into the rationale of why did we buy from Korea and Japan and why did they not buy from us, there could be several reasons. One reason could be we did not negotiate it well. We did not get adequate market access in areas of our interest. And our interest was basically services. Our interest was largely services and agricultural products. Most countries are closed on agricultural products. Most countries are closed on services. Labor movement is politically very sensitive, etc. So either you say that we negotiated those badly, or you say that we were not competitive enough. And I think the truth lies somewhere in between. We are not as competitive as China. We are not as competitive as Japan and Korea and some of the quality products that they sell to us. So, and as I said, I could go on about this, but as I'm saying that politically, the current account deficits became a manifestation of, I would say, the failure of the trade agreements, and therefore no trade agreements got signed until 3 years ago we started one with UAE. And then what happened was that because of the multilateral framework or the multilateral system decline, India has always been a multilateralist, always. They always support multilateral. Everywhere you go, everywhere I've been, in Geneva, in multilateral settings, India always professes to be a staunch multilateralist, which it is. And most emerging markets are multilateralists because they get more benefit from being a multilateralist than from bilateral. But with with the slow decaying of the multilateral system, and this is important, and this your members will also appreciate. Now, to become competitive, this is, China has grown at 8%, 10%. China will not grow as fast. This is India's time to grow. This is India's moment in history. Of course, India's moment was 10 years ago. We didn't leverage it, but we can at least leverage it. This is India's time to grow. And no country, and I'm willing to be challenged on this, no country has become a globally competitive economy and grown fast and become a global superpower without being able to access the global market. India has to access the global market. There is no way. So this is the time when India has to access global markets. Unfortunately, this is also the time when trade liberalization is not happening. Like it did when China was growing, it was hyper globalization. So China got the benefit of global markets like no country in history before it got those benefits. It is India's chance now. Multilateralism is not working. How do you price open new markets? How do you get access to new markets? The only way to do it is either you become a member of the large regional trading blocs called the CPTPP or RCEP. CPTPP is all about standards, so we are not in there. RCEP has China, and we are mortally afraid of what China would do to our economy. So neither multilateralism nor members of these two trading blocs. So what's the option for us? The option for us to get access to global markets is through bilateral trading agreements. And that's what we have been doing. So if you look at the flurry of agreements that we have signed with UAE, with UK, with the EU, with Australia, with the United States, of course, it's gone back to the drawing board. We are now discussing one with Canada, and we are going to start open negotiations with the African continental free trade area, etc. So it is due to, as they say, necessity is the mother of invention. So it's necessary for us to find markets abroad. It's a myth that if you have a large domestic market, you don't need global markets. That's a myth, and that's not true at all. But I won't sort of go overboard on that argument. I'll just assert that even if you're a $4 trillion economy, even if you are the third largest, or when we become the third largest, the force of population will get us there somehow. The power of population will get us. We will become the third largest economy. It's only a matter of time, Rajarshi. We will do that. But I think relying on the domestic market will be both bad economics, and it will be naive to think that our takeoff will be sort of driven by domestic market. No, it will not. Our takeoff can only be driven by competition and participation in global markets. And then because of that, we become competitive, we upgrade, we get better technology, we get better products. and then begin to serve the domestic market. And that's how our takeoff will happen. So to cut a long story short, we need access to global markets. WTO right now is closed. Multilateralism is closed. Large trading blocks we don't participate in, and therefore it's the bilateral agreements that make sense for us. And thankfully, we are doing that, and we are negotiating those agreements.
Context, I would ask two questions before I open the floor to others. One is in lines of what you have said. Our trade agreement with the bloc of ASEAN countries has been a huge loss. We have incurred a substantial current account deficit, which I think we are renegotiating. Number
Yes.
one. Kindly confirm that. And next is when we were student, we never heard of the concept of net FDI. Now today's paper there was a headline: the net FDI in India has come down from $28 billion to $1 billion. Can you explain?
Sure. Okay. The first one, yes, you're right. We are renegotiating our agreement with the ASEAN, and the renegotiation is simply built on the premise, like what you said, because we are running a very large current account deficit with them. We import more than we export, so we are renegotiating. It's much in the lines of what President Trump is saying, that I import so much from you, why don't you buy from me as well? So we are trying to renegotiate with ASEAN and say that, why don't you buy from us? What are the goods that they can, and we can of course export to them. We can provide them services, which is our competitive advantage. We can provide them with certain, chemical products. We can provide them with services. We can provide medical services, and so on. So we are renegotiating with ASEAN so that it reflects our comparative advantage much better. And like we are renegotiating with Japan and Korea to reflect our comparative, to try and get some more market access in Korea and Japan as well. I think you've touched upon a very important point, Rajashi. This is this net FDI, and it's been in the newspapers. It's been talked about a lot, and I would make a plug for an article that I'm writing, in the process of writing. But let me explain what's going on. So India, by virtue of being a high growth economy, for even if you say it's not 8%, they say we are at least growing 6.5%, 7%, 8% we grew. But if you look at a long-term picture, we've grown in the last decade, or the last few years, we've been growing at about 6.5% to 7% in real terms. So we are certainly one of the fastest growing economies in the world, and therefore we are also attracting a lot of FDI. We are attracting a lot of FDI. We get FDI to the tune of $70 to $80 billion a year. So it's not a small amount. But the problem is that it hasn't grown in the last 5 years. If you look at the data of the last 5 years, it's been in the range of 70 to 75 to $80 billion. That's been your gross FDI flows. And, complement to that, which is getting to your question, we have two other sort of variables. One is India's outward FDI, which is how much do Indians export capital outside the country. And these are, the big ticket items. You have the pharmaceutical companies that are present in Africa, in Asia, and you have the IT companies that are present in Southeast Asia, in China, in Europe, in the United States. HCL is present in 160 countries across the world, etc., etc. So you have areas of India's competitive advantage, which is, you would say, IT services, and pharmaceutical. So we have exported capital. So this is emerging market FDI, which is India's FDI to the rest of the world. In addition, not this last 5 years, if you remember those big ticket purchases of companies abroad by the Tatas, Tata Steel acquisition of Chorus, Tata's acquisition of Jaguar Land Rover. There were these Bharti's acquisition of British Telecom. That's poetic irony. Bharti Telecom started with British Telecom investment in India. So British Telecom had a stake in Bharti. Today, capital has flown out and it's in the reverse direction. Bharti owns roughly 24% of British Telecom. And so this is what is called the outward FDI, and it's in the range of, and there may be several other investments that I haven't referred to, but you get the idea that there are investments that Indians make, which is outward FDI. Indian companies make, this is outward FDI. This could be big ticket purchases. This could be diversifying. This could be with a view of serving those markets through host investments. So if I'm TCS, I will invest in China and I will support the Chinese market. I'm HCL, I will invest in the United States and will serve the United States from the American market, etc. So those are diversification strategies so that you can serve those markets through your host country investment. So that's Indian FDI in areas of its importance and if its competitive advantage. Those have been growing. But there is a more troubling aspect of the outward FDI figure, which is about, as I said, roughly about $30 billion today, Rajashri. And the troubling aspect is that some Indian companies are finding it difficult to do business in India because of the various transactions. Ease of doing business is not so easy, or doing business is hard. Their transactions cost, logistics costs are high. The customs clearances are a problem, etc., etc. I don't need to detail that for your members. I'm sure they would have encountered some of these challenges of doing business in India. Although our logistics, our roads are improving, our connectivity is improving, our port turnaround times are improving, etc. But they are still not as good as what they are outside, and compared to China or Singapore or Korea or Japan, Australia, etc., etc. So there is outward flow of FDI, which is the worrying factor, is that companies are investing abroad because they have excess cash flow, they have excess money, and they'd like to diversify and move away from the Indian market. But that still doesn't account for the point that you have made, which is that if we are getting about $80 billion and we have about $30 billion of outflow of FDI, why is our net FDI inflow down to 1 billion? And that's the other bank, which is repatriation of capital. And that's been very high in the last year or so. That's been extremely high, $40 billion. This year, the data that I have seen, which has brought down our net FDI figure to less than $1 billion, Rajashri, that's been about $50 billion of repatriation of capital. So this is an entry, and you'd see it on the RBI annual report. This is, investors selling off in India or monetizing their investment and then going back to, and that's been a lot more. A lot of people are attributing it to the fact that the Indian stock market hit a very high, even in these troubled times. So this was a good time to monetize and good time to cash in and go back. Of course, it has to do also with what's happening to the global trade regime, and the fact that the United States dollar, etc., is whenever there's a crisis, people want to. What they say is that we want to get to flight to safety. So they begin buying gold, they begin buying the US dollar. So in terms of crisis, there's a flight to safety also. So for the global uncertain environment, for the reason that Indian stock markets were unprecedented high valuation, in addition to the FDI outflows, we got repatriation of capital. And that's been, as I said, very, very high. in India in the last year or two. The current figure, as I said, what I recall is about $50 billion. So if you do the math, you do the simple math, $80 billion of inflow, $30 billion of outflow FDI, and $50 billion of repatriation of capital, and you have a net FDI of uh, of almost negligible amount. And that's what's putting, of course, then the consequence of that, of course, is that it puts pressure on the rupee. And therefore the RBI will try and shore up the rupee. But the rupee has fallen significantly and substantially because it will come back as companies invest in India, as this repatriation of capital begins to ease off. India's net FDI will grow. It has been positive over, if you take a longer time period, it has been positive. Our 650 or 600 to 650 billion worth of foreign exchange reserves have been largely built on FDI inflows and NRI investing within the country. Diaspora is also a big story, has been a big story for us. But yeah, that's the answer to your question. It's the outward. I've given a long-winded answer, but I think it's outward FDI, partly diversification, partly to escape the Indian market, and it's a lot to do with repatriation of capital from India.
Overshot our time substantially. I just can't give up talking to you. I'm opening the floor. Does anyone have any question to ask to Dr. Kathuria? And so no question has come. So with one last question, I would like to end. India has stayed out of the regional comprehensive economic partnership. I mean, can you explain why so?
Well, the RCEP, as I was saying in my comments, RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which we pulled out of almost at the last minute, it consists of almost 30% of the world's GDP and 50% of the population of global. Given that India and China are there, we would have been there, and we pulled out of it largely, I think, primarily because of China. And there were some other peripheral concerns with Australia and New Zealand about agricultural products and dairy products, etc., because there was a big opposition from cooperative farmers against the agreement, against RCEP, because Australia and New Zealand, and of course Japan and Korea and all there are 16 members of the RCEP. But I think the worry was much more with China. And the worry was because at that time, we were running almost a $60 billion trade deficit with China. Today, we run a $100 billion trade deficit with China. And at the time we pulled out of the RCEP, we were running almost a $60 billion trade deficit with China. So it was really to protect our manufacturing industry and to some extent, the cooperative dairy farmers. But I don't think that was the primary reason. That would have been a peripheral or a sort of a second rung reason. The main reason was, and if I were to put it poetically, I would just say the agreement with RCEP wasn't an agreement with RCEP. It was a surrogate for a free trade agreement with China. That was the dominant feeling, that it was actually, because we have a free trade agreement with ASEAN, we have with Japan, we have with Korea, we've signed one later with Australia. So it was thought that this was actually not RCEP that we are negotiating. We are negotiating a free trade agreement with China. In other words, a surrogate for a free trade agreement with China. And that, I think, was too much of a risk to take, especially when growth rates had started to decline. And just when we were negotiating, Indian growth rate had fallen to about 4.2%, and subsequently COVID happened and we went minus. But that's when we pulled out. It was just on the eve of COVID that we pulled out of the FTA, the RCEP agreement.
Just two short questions to end. is our if you look at the capacity utilization of our Indian economy as a whole, are we at 100%? Number one.
Not,
And
uh,
number two, next question is, we have brought China many times in the topic. The kind of scale China has achieved, can we ever achieve that? And I mean, what do we need to do achieve that?
yeah, I mean, okay, I could. Yeah, so the first question is easier to answer. Yes, there is some excess capacity in Indian industry. Of course, it varies by sector, so there is excess capacity, and but it's nothing compared to the excess capacity that was created as a result of the Liberation Day tariffs of the United States. And there was so much worry in India that we would become a dumping ground for the Chinese excess capacity that was created, or excess stocks that in China, India would become a dumping ground. And in any case, as I said, we have a 100 billion trade deficit with China, up from about 60 billion on the eve of pulling out of RCEP. So our trade deficit with China has grown. Imagine what it would have been had we got into RCEP. It would have probably been a lot more anticipated. It was anticipated to be a lot more. But yes, we have excess capacity because demand. I mean, while consumption or demand has been the mainstay of our economy, it's been purchasing power. As you know, there's inequality, etc., in the system. Therefore, the purchasing power has not grown as expected. So there is excess capacity. Export markets are also uh, in a slump, and therefore, which has led to this creation of excess capacity. As demand picks up, and as our macroeconomic growth stabilizes and as it democratizes, as this trickle down, I think demand will pick up. We are hoping that demand would pick up in India so that capacity utilization comes back to the norm, which is not 100%. The norm, 80%, 75 to 80%. If it's on average, I think even below that. RBI has the exact figures of capacity utilization. The second part of your question is, will we ever achieve the scale of China? uh, you, we are often you're bound by your legacy. You have what is called path dependence often in your growth. Either you have a scorched earth model, you destroy everything and rebuild. I don't think it's going to happen in India like that. You won't have a scorched earth. Scorched means you burn up everything. I mean, it's a textbook formulation of a nation building strategy. But I don't think we'll have a scorched earth kind of phenomena in India. But we will have a lot of path dependence. And path dependence or initial conditions matter. They lead me to believe that if we achieve scale, we would probably never achieve the scale that China has been able to achieve, because it's not one thing that China put into. It was several things that allowed China to achieve that scale. It was land, it was the banking financial system, it was the subsidized loans that were available, it was the reason to compete, it was with showcase China's Shenzhen grew because it wanted to showcase uh, it as a rival to Shenzhen, to Hong Kong. And you won't believe it, I don't know how many of your members will know that there were cities in China that were known as button cities. Your buttons of your shirt. There were entire cities that were producing only buttons. They were called button cities. There were entire cities that were producing only lighters, cigarette lighters. They were called lighter cities. Entire cities specializing in the production of only buttons or only lighters. You can imagine the kind of scale China would have got. And these are all the coastal regions in China when they were creating the special economic zone and they became the factory of the world. So that scale was mind boggling. Their automobile factories, if you ever visit an automobile factory, you need a golf cart to travel from one end of the automobile factory to the other. And this is the norm, this is the rule. So and this is China. So I mean that's your comparator. And then you have India, where you have labor laws that prevented you from hiring more than 100 people. Uh, that kicked in, the Industrial Disputes Act. Of course, now that figure has been increased to 300, and our labor laws are being modified. I'm just picking on one example that comes readily to mind, that sort of showcases or that helps understand why we will probably never achieve the scale of China. Because the moment you become, why services in India became big, because they were never under laws of the government, because all the laws were in manufacturing and industry. By the time the services industry grew, the government realized it had grown much beyond what it had anticipated. But a lot of people joke that had government anticipated the Y2K problem, it would have taxed the industry, and therefore services would have also. I mean, I'm being critical of the government, but just to say that a lot of things prevented India from achieving the scale of China, and labor laws and all the things about logistics, etc. So size wasn't regarded as something beautiful. And if you remember the old industrial policies, concentration of economic power was something that our early economists frowned upon. The Mahalanobis, the Rudras, the early planners of India, they frowned upon size. They frowned upon concentration, because they said if companies become big, if firms became big, then they would exploit, they would become monopolies, and they would exploit the monopoly power. As history has it, they didn't become big, but they became monopolies, and they exploited because of the license Raj that was introduced to stop firms from becoming big, but license Raj enabled them to become monopolies and powerful. So, so that history, and with the slow liberalization that has happened, but we are hostages, we are prisoners of what we have done in the past. So there is a lot of path dependence too. So to cut a long story short, services might become big, have become big, IT has become big. For manufacturing to kind of achieve the scale of a China, I would say it's impossible. I don't think we'll ever achieve in textiles, in automobiles, in chemicals, in steel, etc. We have the second largest steel plant in the world today in Jindal Steel Plant, second largest. And it is less than half the size of the largest steel plant in China. And that's the second largest in the world, in terms of ports, in terms of railways, etc. We may be big, but we are dwarfed by China. So no, the answer to your question is no. And the next question would be, Rajarshi, the next question is should we? And that could be a second order question, or a debate or a discussion, maybe for next time. We've overshot. But it's also relevant to ask that question. Should we try and mimic China in terms of manufacturing size to achieve those economies of scale? Or are there alternative ways to get competitive without having to grow in the same size the way China did, given that we don't have that kind of land, given that our land markets are no way as controlled in India as they are by the Chinese government? So should we go down that route at all? Could be a topic for subsequent discussion.
Sir, we have overshot. We have to end now. Thank you very much. Until we meet again.
Thank you. I hope this made sense to you.
Sure.